Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Sofia Jeppsson about why we should not take mental illness to function as an exemption from moral responsibility, and why we shouldn't take what P.F. Strawson called the objective stance towards those who are mentally ill.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Sofia Jeppsson, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at Umeå University, which is in Sweden. Sofia's areas of interest include free will, moral responsibility, applied ethics, including animal ethics, and the philosophy of psychiatry. And she's published several papers on issues in the free will debate in particular, including a recent paper that I really enjoyed on Dirk Perboom's manipulation argument against compatibilism. Today, however, we'll be focusing on some of her recent work on mental illness and moral responsibility. So welcome to the show, Sophia. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Happy to be here. Yeah, so it's hard to say when I first became interested in free will, because I think it goes all the way back to when I first decided I would want to become a philosopher, actually. This is kind of a funny story, but I was working in nursing at the time as like an unskilled nurse or patient tech. I'm never quite sure how to translate my whole job title. But then I took evening classes in philosophy just because I thought it seemed interesting. We had some lectures on free will, and we had this pretty harsh professor who would like shoot people down if they asked what he thought were stupid questions. And on a free will lecture in the coffee break, there were a couple of girls talking in the break about how they hadn't understood something. I don't remember now exactly what it was, but they didn't dare to ask the professor. And I had understood the thing, so I went up to them and explained it. And then one of them said, "You should be a philosophy professor because that's a really good explanation. You should lecture about free will."
Yeah.
And then I thought, because I had kind of wondered what I was going to do with my life long term, that, yeah, I'm going to be a philosophy professor and do
awesome.
free will.
Nice.
And I actually eventually did, although obviously not like the next day or so, but it took a few years. So I kind of always been into free will ever since I started doing philosophy.
Nice.
But mostly on the more ethical side than the metaphysical side of things.
Yeah.
Nice.
Cool, yeah. In recent work, you criticized theorists who take mental illness to function as an exemption from moral responsibility. Would you mind explaining the idea of an exemption and how it's different from an excuse?
So the idea here is that, maybe it's easiest by just giving textbook examples first. So the typical textbook examples of excuse are like temporarily loss of control or just lacking some crucial piece of information. So maybe I walk by one of you on the street and shove you hard so you fall over. This would normally be a wrongful thing to do, but then it turns out I stepped on an ice patch, so I temporarily lost control, so now I'm excused. Or maybe I keep my neighbor up all night by blasting loud music, but for some kind of comprehensible reasons, I thought he was out of town, so I missed that crucial piece of information, so I'm excused. And then exemptions relate more to people who are not seen as morally responsible agents in the first place, like young children, people with intellectual disabilities, people with mental disorders. And then this distinction has been criticized in the literature, like Dana Nelkin and David Brink, two philosophers, said that if you look at these textbook examples, you can see that excuses are local and temporary and comes from something external to the agent's mind, and exemptions are more long-term and global and comes from some condition inside the agent's mind. And these features could be mixed up in various ways, actually. So the distinction has been criticized, but it's still very common and mainstream in philosophy. And sometimes in more Strawson-inspired moral responsibility philosophy, this distinction is explained in terms of the participant and objective attitude. So I'm going to explain what that is about. So here the idea is that we can take a participant attitude to other people and see them as like fellow adults with whom we can have reciprocal, normal relationships. And when we see people this way, we tend to hold them responsible for what they do. But occasionally we can excuse them in situations like the ones I just mentioned, when someone didn't know what they were doing, like I didn't know I disturbed my neighbor because I thought he was out of town, or they temporarily lost control, but we normally hold them responsible. And then the opposite of that is take an objective attitude to someone and more see them like this thing that can be disruptive, but we got to manage them somehow. So you no longer relate to them as a fellow adult, as a fellow person. You more just try to manage or handle them somehow. And when you relate to someone in that way, there is no place for holding them responsible, just, trying to manage them as best you can.
Yeah.
So that is also one way to work out this distinction.
Nice. Well, often theorists of moral responsibility talk about mental illness as an exemption rather than an excuse. What sorts of mental illness do most theorists have in mind when they talk about exemptions? And why do they take those mental illnesses to provide exemptions from moral responsibility?
Well, first there's this large literature on philosophers who discuss highly idealized, I'd say often actually pretty unrealistic cases of kleptomania or agoraphobia or other neuroses. And they say this undermines responsibility within some particular domain. But when they talk about complete exemptions and people who are just not fit to be morally responsible agents in the first place, the focus tends to be more on schizophrenia or just generally psychosis disorders that comes up. So I actually remember attending a talk by Susan Wolf for the Society of Applied Philosophy. It was a few years ago. Where I don't remember the entire context, but she talked about some theory and said this seems to imply that people with schizophrenia can be morally responsible. And that would supposedly be some kind of reductio of the theory or idea in question, because it's supposed to be so obvious that when you have something serious like schizophrenia or in general some kind of psychosis, then you can't be responsible for what you do. And so I'm going to say something about why people take that to be the case. I think there are three reasons that might not be completely separate. But first, there is this idea that in order to be morally responsible in general, you need to be responsive to reasons. So a lot of philosophers will agree that this is a necessary condition for being morally responsible, even if they disagree a lot with each other on what amounts to jointly sufficient conditions. Yeah. And so the idea is that you have to be responsive to reasons, and further than that, if you have schizophrenia, schizospectrum, some kind of psychosis disorder, then you're just completely out of the rationality ballpark, and you're not responsive to reasons anymore, so you can't be responsible. And I mean, this isn't really true. This is kind of a pretty black and white picture of what it's like to have this kind of disorder, this kind of madness. It's kind of much more complicated than that. First, because you can have schizo something or other and still have your ups and downs. But also, even in the middle of a psychotic episode, you might have bizarre experiences. You might see the world very differently, but you might still think in terms of what you have reason to do and so on. Yeah. So this picture is not really true, but it's common. And I think that's the first reason why people think that, well, if you have something like this, you are obviously completely exempted and you are not a morally responsible agent. Then there is this whole legacy of Strawson that I mentioned before, 20th century philosopher P.F. Strawson, not to be mixed up with his son Galen Strawson, who is active today, but the older Strawson. When he talked about, as if it were pretty obvious, that you can't really have these reciprocal relationships with hopeless schizophrenics and the warped and deranged and the compulsive neurotic. So these are all his terms from his famous paper, Freedom and Resentment. Like, he really talks in these pretty terrible ableist ways. But anyway, you can't have normal relationships with people like that. So there is no place for holding them responsible either, because you just try to manage them. And then there is also this common idea that, and this is also related to the legacy of Strawson, I think, but it has a wider grip on philosophers who aren't particularly Strawson inspired too, that either we can completely exempt people with serious mental disorders, or the other option would be to angrily blame them for all the crazy things they do, and that seems mean, so instead we should completely exempt them. And I think that's, as you know, I think that is also too black and white, and it's kind of a false dichotomy. But these are, I think, basically the reasons why people think these are completely exempting conditions.
Right.
So you've already mentioned some of the reasons, I think, why we might be critical of the idea that we should take the objective attitude towards those with mental illness. But could you summarize more succinctly some of your criticisms of why we shouldn't do that?
Yeah, so first, the objective attitude is isolating. And when I say this, I get a lot of pushback from people who says that, according to Strawson, we also take the objective attitude to children. So that kind of proves that it's fine. But first of all, it's not really cool as an actual adult to be infantilized either, looked upon as a little child. But also, second, I don't think we can take the fact that he throws in children there as an example of people we take the objective attitude to as some kind of proof that this isn't objectifying in any way, because we don't have proof in the first place that Strawson had a great attitude to children. But setting the historical Strawson aside and how defensive people can become when they think you're saying something mean about this great philosopher, and just looking at this attitude of trying to manage and handle someone rather than really interact with them and reason with them. When that happens to you, when people just try to manage and handle you, you become socially isolated. Even if other people are in your physical proximity, there is a sense in which you're now completely isolated from them. If they think you're unfit to reason with and no longer listen to the content of what you say, you're also helpless in a way. Now you can't protest against anything that's done to you because the content of what you say is no longer taken into account. It's just going to be hard as, crazy noises from the crazy person that we're trying to manage. So you become helpless and isolated. This is something that is widely acknowledged, that being regarded objectively has this downside in that you're not taken seriously. Even though I might play up that downside a bit more than many other philosophers do. So people do think that it's important that we not subject others to this objective attitude unless it's actually fitting. Like, we shouldn't do this to too many people. We should only do this to people who are crazy enough, basically. But I think this leads into a further problem with the idea that people with serious mental disorders should be regarded objectively and completely exempted. And that is what my friend and colleague Per Milan, rather fittingly, I think, called the no true madman fallacy, because this leads philosophers who embrace this sort of traditional view, okay, serious mental disorders mean you should regard this person objectively and exempt them. It leads them to, want to exclude everyone they actually talk to from this group of people.
Right.
So I have actually been told by a colleague when I started saying that, I don't really want to be regarded objectively because I have a mental disorder on the schizo spectrum. And he was like, but this doesn't apply to you because you're mostly normal. And so, I'm not a true madman. I'm mostly normal. And the same goes for everyone else you ever meet and talk to. Like the real mad people whom we should regard objectively and exempt, they're like out there somewhere always. They're not among us philosophers. So that's I think one more problem with this mainstream view. And this also leads me to how it's problematic even if you actually are very mad at the moment. Because if we agree that, here and now in conversation with you guys, I am mostly normal and we can talk to each other like normal people do, I can say from personal experience that even when you are in the middle of psychosis, it can be very, very helpful if other people and your loved ones or your doctors and clinicians still really do their best to listen to what you say and try to put themselves in your shoes and understand what you're going through and empathize with you. And on the contrary, it can be really hurtful if they're just seeing you as this object to be managed and handled. Right. And even if the latter in some situations become inevitable because communication just totally breaks down, then it's still a tragic inevitability. It's not like something good or just normal and fitting and obvious that we take this objective attitude to the mad person and just try to manage and handle them instead of really talking to them and trying to empathize. But if you think that this is the obvious way to treat people, at least when they're fully psychotic, you won't even try to do anything else. And I'm kind of talking from personal experience here, but there are also empirical researchers who write about this, like psychiatrist Rosa Ritonano at Manchester University has written about the importance of empathizing with and really listening to people in psychosis. Psychologists like Louis Sanz has written about this and so on. So, yeah, so that is, I think, one more problem with the idea that you should have total exemption and objective attitude, at least if someone is psychotic and, so to speak, fully mad.
Yeah.
If I can ask one follow-up question here, one of the things I found really interesting in at least one of your papers is this idea that you can't take the objective attitude towards yourself. And since you mentioned some of your personal experience, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. I'm just curious what it would mean to take the objective attitude towards yourself, why you think that can't happen, even in the case of psychosis, say.
Yeah. So thanks for that question. Yeah. So I think this is a big oversight in the literature that philosophers tend only to discuss how to treat others who are mad. But it's just this assumption that everyone works from, that we're discussing mad people or people with serious mental disorders. I'm kind of switching back and forth between these terms, as you noticed. Yeah. So madness is kind of common in certain academic circles and certain activist circles, but obviously it's more standard to use more medical terms. But anyway, there is this underlying assumption in most of the philosophical literature that, mad people are out there. So the question is how to relate to them, not how to relate to yourself if it happens to you. But I don't think, no, that you can really just manage and handle yourself. If we look at the situation here and now, to some extent, we can like manipulate ourselves and trying to trick ourselves and manage ourselves. And this is a very familiar fact of life for all people. But we cannot completely do that instead of exercising agency, because manipulation requires a manipulator too, not just someone being manipulated. Managing someone requires a manager, not just someone being managed. So you can't ever, in your own case, get away from just exercising your agency and directly experiencing yourself as an agent, not just a thing to be managed. It's not in principle impossible. It's not in principle impossible to take a strictly objective attitude to your past self. But it can still be psychologically hard if it just doesn't fit your past experiences and your memories of events. If you remember, still exercising your agency, however flawed that exercise was, because you were caught up in bizarre experiences, you were very stressed out, you had strange beliefs and so on, but you still try to find the best option and do what you had reason to do. If you remember all that, it's just hard to convince yourself that, no, at that point, I was just a complete non-agent. Things just happened to me. I was helpless, and so I have no responsibility, because it just isn't an accurate description.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, you've also suggested in recent work that there are sustainable alternatives to the view that mental illness always functions as an exemption, such as that mental illness can function as an excuse, or that the mentally ill agent was justified in acting the way that they did. Could you talk through these two alternatives and explain when you think they apply?
So I should first of all say that the terms excuse and exemption aren't actually what matters most here. So if someone wants to say that if you don't blame someone because of a mental disorder, then this is by definition an exemption or something along these lines, I'm like, fine, call it what you want. But what I really want to say is that you don't have to take a step back and look at people in this objective way in order not to blame them. What you can do instead is, trying to put yourself in their shoes and empathize, and on those grounds, cut people some slack. Because I think this is also an assumption that's very common in the moral responsibility literature, that no one might actually say this explicitly. There's this underlying assumption that our moral responsibility practices are pretty harsh on normal and sane people, that if you're normal and sane and do wrong, people will harshly blame you. But if you're put in this objective attitude exemption group, you are protected against that. And this is not really an accurate picture of our practices. So first, there is empirical research on the fact that groups of people who are regarded as irrational and out of control tend to be blamed harsher and be held more responsible than people who are considered sane and rational and in control and so on. So our practices are much harsher towards those considered irrational and out of control than what you might think just from reading moral responsibility philosophy. And the flip side on that is that when someone is considered like a normal, rational person, we are often willing to cut them a lot of slack a lot of the time, just for things like, oh, sorry, I was stressed out, that's why I snapped at you, didn't mean it. Oh, I forgot that promise I made, but I haven't slept all night because my sick toddler kept me up and so on. People throw around excuses all the time, and we cut them slack all the time. Even if someone isn't 100% excused for something, they're partially excused, slack is cut. And I think this can go a long way even in cases of mental disorders. So first, if we look at stuff like being tired, exhausted, very stressed out, obviously you can be all these things from a mental disorder. And, that could ground excuses just like being tired and exhausted because you're a parent and your child was sick, or just because you had so much to do at work can underlie excuses. And also, it makes sense to judge people less harshly when they did wrong if doing right would have been very, very difficult. Dan Elkin has a great paper on this, and Susan Wolf also mentions this in her old Freedom Within Reason book. And this can also be applied to a lot of cases of mental disorders. They can make doing various things much more difficult, and that makes people less blameworthy when they fail to do these things. And also, when it comes to being caught up in psychosis or delusions, we can look at standard excuses of being innocently ignorant of something, sitting on the wrong information and acting from that. So I think the kind of excuses we use all the time for sane and normal people can often be applied in mental disorder cases too. Sometimes the excuse might be stronger because the stress you're under because of your mental disorder is a much more extreme kind of stress than most people ever experience. Or, getting accurate information and sorting out your beliefs might be much more difficult than it is for most people to get accurate information and so on. But it's still like excuses of the same kind, rather than saying that, this person is not even an agent, hardly even a person, so we just exempt them. So that's for excuses. And I think all of these excuses require that you try to understand what the situation was like for the person, and at least to some extent empathize with the person, which is much more constructive, much better for everyone involved, not as isolating as instead taking a step back and going, oh, this is some kind of weird-ass non-agent whom we should just exempt. So that's about excuses. So moving on to justifications then. I got some really good comments from August Gorman here, who's also a colleague. And that was what actually prompted me to put this justification part in, because previously in this paper under review that Taylor has read, it was only about excuses. But August writes about fair allocation of burdens in terms of neuropsychiatric conditions, and then that would obviously apply to straight out psychiatric conditions too, that we often expect those who are different to do all the adjustment, which means that they have to carry all the burdens of, using their willpower, getting emotionally exhausted and so on from doing all these adjustments. And August writes on how burdens should just be more equally distributed when people have to adjust to each other. So I have this specific example, which is something I've done, not just once, but a bunch of times when I was younger, which is going home to people and waking them up in the middle of the night and wanting to hide in their apartment because I thought I was pursued. This is at least prima facie wrongful. Like you drag people up in the middle of the night, might frighten them, they lose sleep, which might make work or studies harder for them. And August said that, but on the other hand, if I had just stayed home in my own apartment, I would have been scared shitless all night, which would have been terrible for me. So even if I could have done that, it's not completely obvious that I couldn't, see previous comments about how you're not a total non-agent as soon as you're in a psychotic episode. Maybe I could have convinced myself to stay in my apartment all night and just, powered through all that horrible fear without giving into it. But that would have been really, really hard on me.
Mm-hmm.
And when we discussed this case, I said I'm uncertain if this amounts to justification. Maybe in some cases you are justified to put that burden on your friends rather than powering through all that mental suffering. Sometimes you might not be, but you're only a little bit blameworthy, even if you're not fully justified. But then in addition to things like this, which actually causes some harm to people around you, like making them lose sleep and so on, there are also a lot of things that mad people do and neurodivergent people do that are just weird, but actually completely harmless.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also something that moral responsibility philosophy tend to overlook. But in our actual world, rather than the idealized place that some philosophers like to imagine we live in, people are blamed all the time for doing things that are just weird, even though they are harmless. And that's just something we should stop with.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
So it seems like there's sort of a spectrum here of it might be that someone does something that isn't wrong in the first place, and so either they don't even really need justification because it's just weird but not harmful, or it's harmful but given August's work on fair allocations of burdens, they're justified in perhaps burdening someone they're in a close relationship with or something like that. But
yeah,
then,
it might be justified because it's still less bad than
right.
taking all the burdens on yourself in some cases.
Yeah, but then even if they're not justified, it might be that there's at least a partial excuse or maybe a full excuse. And we can say all of that without regarding the mentally ill person as exempt from moral responsibility in general or taking the objective stance towards them.
Yeah, that's very well put, describing it as a spectrum like this.
I think that's helpful.
Yeah. I was thinking too, like if you are responsive to reasons when you're in the middle of a psychotic episode, and you believe that someone is a pursuer, I think that's the word that you used when you were afraid. In a certain sense, it seems like, well, if they are correct and there is a pursuer, then we should give them the benefit of the doubt just in case, because if there is a pursuer, something really bad could happen. So in this case, like, we'll play it safe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, actually, in my case, I've been afraid of demons, so not really humans. So I guess that's a little far out for other people to give me the benefit of the doubt. But then once again, it still helps a lot if other people try to listen and understand to some extent what I'm going through, even if I can still tell that, they don't believe this. They haven't seen what I've seen, so they can't possibly believe this. I might think, but then it's still helpful to feel heard and listen to. But so I want to clarify a bit this with reasons responsiveness. So I'm not saying there is no difference between a psychotic person and a non-psychotic person when it comes to reasons responsiveness, because that would be a pretty weird and extreme claim. But for instance, you might still believe things for reasons because you experience strange things. And I have also written about how you might experience a kind of doubt, a little similar to philosophical skeptical doubt, but at the same time, it really goes to your core and really hits you rather than being an intellectual exercise, which simultaneously undermines a lot of the epistemic reasons you would otherwise have not to trust your bizarre experiences or hallucinatory experiences. So there can be all these kind of things that goes on, which makes it a case that you can still explain which reasons this person had for believing what they believed, even if their beliefs are crazy by regular standards. So, there are things that are off, but not in the sense that now there are no reasons any longer and beliefs just come from out of the blue with no explanation whatsoever. And same thing for actions. So I kind of go into this in some depth in my paper, Psychosis and Intelligibility, which is published in Philosophy, Psychology, and Psychiatry. But that's roughly the gist of it.
Yeah, very interesting.
So it turns out that it's actually surprisingly difficult for philosophers to pinpoint, for instance, the difference between a delusion and a regular belief, or what really is the mark of psychosis. So a lot of these things are like, you know it when you see it for psychiatrists, but it turns out to be surprisingly difficult to really pinpoint the differences philosophically, because there is so much overlap. So, for instance, delusions have been described as not responsive to reasons, unlike ordinary beliefs. But, for instance, Carolina Flores has a very good paper where she discusses that people with delusions will typically actively cling to the delusions by trying to avoid counter evidence, and if they're still presented with counter evidence, they will have ad hoc explanations why this counter evidence can't be trusted, which is actually just regular people, so to speak, who have cherished beliefs behave. So it's still like a psychiatrist or other clinician will know when they see it that something is a clinical delusion, not just a somewhat irrational belief, but it's just very hard to find and pinpoint an exact difference. But I think a lot of moral responsibility literature, which discusses different mental disorders and so on, is just not sufficiently empirically informed. And this is a problem.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, thanks so much for joining us again, Sophia. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Yeah, I have a departmental website, and I also have a personal website, which has a pretty simple address. It's just www.sofiajeppsson.com. And it's Sofia Jeppsson as one word. The tricky thing is just to remember that it's double P and double S in my surname.
Yeah.
Most people want to remove either a P or an S.
Yeah, we'll make sure to link both of those in the show notes. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you. It was nice to be here.
Yeah. In our next episode, we will talk with John Stegall about omissions and Frankfurt cases.